Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see that the number of participants is rising and will continue to rise in the next few seconds, but I will start the meeting. Thank you for joining us today. I said good afternoon, but I see some attendees from the West, so good morning for some of the people, Calgary and other places. Interesting topic today. We've done a few of those webinars. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Are there too many of us? Overcoming divisions in the sector, and we have two great people to talk about this. The Honorable Andy Mitchell, former Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and Bob Friesen, a long-term farmer advocate who's held many positions advocating on behalf of the sector. Technical notes, we have all attendees that will be able to ask questions for the Q&A button that is located at the bottom of your screen. I will look at the questions and put them to our panelists. So please feel free to ask questions. I see a number of attendees who are certainly not tongue-tied. I see Alex Binkley as a journalist, two of our former chairs, Leanne Dwyer and Wilf Keller, lots of people in attendance here that certainly will want to ask questions. So I'm first going to start by introducing our two speakers, panelists, but rather than me going into a long diatribe of what they've said, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. The Honorable Andy Mitchell, former Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Andy, if you can say a few words to introduce yourself and talk about the topic, and then I'll move it on to Bob.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I look forward to a lively discussion. As you mentioned, I'm the former Minister of Agriculture. I'm currently, as you can see from my background, I'm a mayor of Selwyn Township, which is a community in central Ontario or eastern Ontario, depending on your perspective. Also deputy warden of the county of Peterborough, which is we have quite a bit of agriculture in our particular area. I look forward to seeing Bob again, and he and I were the minister and a chief advocate in his role as president of the CFA. And I just to start with a few opening comments. So first of all, from a minister's perspective, and that's what most of what I'm going to talk about is from that perspective. Advocacy by agricultural groups are important, and they're really essential for the development of public policy. They provide information to a minister that they would not otherwise have, and that's critical. Some points to today's conversation. First of all, is to remember that quality trumps volume. So a very knowledgeable, concise, informative presentation to a minister is very welcomed. Volumes are not necessarily the key thing. Expertise trumps politics. When I was a minister, I had a pretty good understanding where somebody was coming politically. And what I really needed to know was their expert opinion. And relationship trumps rhetoric. A key to good advocacy is the relationships that are established with officials, with political staff, with the minister. It isn't just simply about rhetoric. As I said, it's really, from a minister's standpoint, it's about getting information from people who have expertise and experience. And often it allows you as a minister to test the hypothesis that you're receiving from your officials and from central agencies with somebody who actually is trying to live with whatever it is that you're trying to do. Just very briefly, it's incumbent, I think, on organizations that they need to be effective. And there are four things that I would just briefly say. Really important to be prepared. If you're going to get to see officials, if you're going to be making advocacy to a minister, you need to be prepared, professional, knowledgeable, know who you're meeting, and know that what your key messages are. It's also important to understand what's possible and to avoid the impossible. You can go into a minister and ask them to repudiate the policy of their government, and you can make that request. It's probably not the most effective way to use your time. What you want to use your time on is asking the minister or his senior or her senior officials to do things that they are able to do. Very important to understand the difference between policy and politics. There's a place for both, and to understand the difference between the two. Really important to include both listening and talking. Talking is about you making your points to the minister, but don't forget to go silent and let the minister and his or her officials talk, because that's how you gain a lot of intelligence. And in any meeting with a minister, make sure that the minister has that the minister is clear about what your ask is. I can't tell you how many times I met with organizations who, when the meeting was over, I turned to my staff who were with me and said, can you tell me what they were asking for? Because it's critically important to have a very concise and straightforward ask so that the minister can respond to it and act on it. So those are some opening comments, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy, for this. And Bob, when you met with Andy, did you leave any doubt in terms of what you were asking?
Well, that's a good question. That's something that he should probably answer, but it certainly is a pleasure for me to be here together with Andy Mitchell. I would have to say that he was one of the best agricultural ministers Canada had, and I enjoyed working with him, and I'll get into a little more detail in a bit. But I wanted to just echo what he said about when you meet with a minister. And that is being concise. That is quality is better than quantity. You know, I've been in meetings with politicians and with colleagues from the industry, and it seems as if they would rather just have a friendly conversation and then get out of there. And that's not what these meetings are about. It's like Andy said, these meetings are about presenting a concise and precise policy issue, perhaps, or an ask, and so the minister knows. And the other thing that I think we sometimes forget is that the government isn't there for us to fight. We always took the stance that our number one approach was to collaborate. You're not necessarily partners, you're not necessarily friends, but you're collaborators, and that's really what we like to do, and that is collaborate. But I have to tell you a couple of stories about working with Andy, and I won't take very long. Before I do that, I want to, in the interest of full disclosure, say that while I am on contract on a couple of files with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture right now, I do their trade file, their transportation file, and actually I have the opportunity now to be a co-manager of the Hay West initiative that they've started. But I want to say that I am not here as a spokesperson for CFA today. I'm here to talk about my experiences when I was vice president and president of CFA. And that was, of course, when I had the opportunity to work with Andy. I was with him in Hong Kong. In fact, an argument could be made that he lost the election that time because he spent probably a week in Hong Kong when he could have been door knocking. And I think you lost that election by just a couple of votes. And so he was in Hong Kong working for Canada, and Canada to him was first before Andy Mitchell. And that says something about the quality of the person that we're together with currently. But you know, one of the things I will remember is the meeting that we had in Bolivia, Karen's ministerial meeting. And of course, the Karen's Farm Group was there as well. And as was typical, they had drafted a minister's declaration, and someone from the department at Andy's encouragement came to me to consult on the draft declaration to see if we had any issues with it. And I named 3 concerns that we had with the declaration. The staff person promptly went into the meeting where Minister Mitchell was in, together with the other ministers, and I waited outside the door. And by the time Andy came out of the door, he said to me, he says, "Bob, I've already heard your concerns. I've already figured out how I'm going to get your concerns out of the declaration on 2 of those issues, and the other one I'll figure out. The next morning at 7 o'clock, his staff actually woke me up and said, Bob, the minister would like to meet with you. And I kind of groaned to myself, and I said, oh no, he's going to tell us he couldn't do it. We showed up in his hotel suite, and he said, well, you had 3 concerns and I got rid of all of them. That is collaboration, and that is working together. And then finally, my last point, and this really speaks to the meeting that you've got here today, Serge. Andy and I met at a Liberal convention, and he pulled me aside and says, Bob, I'd like to talk to you. Or maybe I pulled him aside, I'm not sure. Anyway, we had a particular issue we want to talk about, and I said to him, I said, Minister, I need to give you a heads up. We just did a press release that is fairly critical of your approach on an issue. I can't remember what it was. And he said, Bob, I've already read it. My staff came up to me and said, what the heck does Friesen think he's doing, saying those things? And Andy told me, he said, you know what I told my staff? I said, listen, for me to be a credible minister and for Bob to be a credible farm leader, he has to tell me what the farmers are telling him. And he told his staff, that's all Bob is doing. He's just saying what farmers are telling him. And I want to meet with farm leaders that speak for their constituents. That's the best way to work things out. And so I have some great memories of working together with Andy. But I think that last point really speaks to how organizations need to deal with the minister. It's not a fight. It's not at a personal level. The minister is doing what he has to do, he or she have to do, because they do represent all of Canada, and the farm leaders have to speak on behalf of the constituents they represent, and then together work things out.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's a very good introduction, Bob and Andy. I do appreciate that. Both of you have indicated that quality is better than quantity, and that really speaks to one of the key issues we do want to raise here. Indeed, it is, some people think it's the number of meetings that you've had that is important, not what you've said in the meetings or what you've achieved in the meetings. And others think that if you have lots of organizations knocking on the same door, maybe something will happen. It really brings me to the first question. There are literally thousands of organizations that represent various sections of the agri-food sector. 1,200 are registered to lobby. Do you think that there are too many organizations representing the sector? Is the sector's representation effective even though it is divided? Can you comment on that? Andy?
Sure. Well, if you have too many voices coming at you at one time, it can be problematic. That's straightforward. But it's not surprising that there are that many organizations. Agriculture is a complex industry, and it's operating at various levels. When you go right through the value chain, right there, it's challenging. So I'd have 3 suggestions based on my experience. Number one is the importance of umbrella organizations, aggregate organizations. They play a critical role, and from a minister's perspective, it is very useful to deal with organizations that in my case represent it at a national level. It's critical that the industry itself create processes to build industry consensus. So not all organizations are going to take the same view or same perspective, and there are some issues on which you may not be able to find common ground. But those national organizations, those umbrella organizations, have a role to play in trying to find and to build that kind of consensus. And the final thing I would say is it's really critical to focus on message and not necessarily the delivery agent. If your message is being delivered to the government, whether you yourself as perhaps a smaller organization deliver it or not is not key. What's key is that the government hears your message and that it knows that that's what the industry is thinking. So those are some thoughts about that.
Bob, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, sure. I don't think that the number of organizations that we have in Canada necessarily means that they're divided. I have always subscribed to the notion that you need sector-specific or commodity-specific organizations to speak for their specific industry dynamics, their specific policy issues. When it comes to a policy issue that transcends that specific commodity, of course, there needs to be collaboration. So, of course, the minister is going to listen to someone from the pork industry. They may have something specific regarding the pork industry, and it's something that they can cover better than an umbrella organization. However, when it comes to policy issues that transcend any specific sectors, then there needs to be collaboration. Our approach always was, when I was president, that we did not speak for a specific commodity unless they endorsed what we were saying. And so, yes, on general policy issues, we would be the spokesperson after we had collaborated with all our members. We also try to reach out to non-members to see what their position was. And on that front, I have to tell you that the current president of CFA, Mary Robinson, has done an excellent job of reaching out to CFA non-members and to other sectors to make sure that that they are involved in the things that the CFA does. She's done an excellent job, probably the best job of any president, in reaching out to CFA non-members. And I've, being on the trade file, I've even seen her do it internationally, and that's really important. And so, yes, you need to have umbrella organizations that get together with their members, that collaborate, and CFA is a federation of agricultural organizations. You collaborate on general issues. You try to have a single message for the minister, and that works best. Then, of course, everybody benefits: the organizations, the farmers, and the minister that represents the government. I can tell you that the Minister's Safety Net Advisory Committee was one forum where I thought there was excellent collaboration when I was president of CFA. That included all CFA members, and it included the commodity organizations that were not members of CFA. And around that table, there was a lot of collaboration. And when that committee made a recommendation, everybody agreed to it. And so that was a good example of all the different sectors collaborating.
But so I'm going to follow up on this, Bob, and say you've been generous to say it is everybody has a role, etc. But then I'm going to push you a little bit and say, okay, so the sector is funding X amount of CEOs, X amount of executive directors. They're funding organizations all over the place. And what I hear from producers and various people on the ground is they don't know anymore who to send their dollars to. And for them, there are too many people representing issues, either on a regional basis. There are dozens of provincial organizations. Much more than dozens, but there are provincial organization, regional organization, issue-specific organization, commodity groups, etc. And people are saying that is a lot of overhead to carry. What do you say to that?
Well, my initial reaction would be that's up to the farmers that are paying the bill, right? But I would have to say that there have to be clear lines of communication and accountability. There have to be very clear lines of accountability. Currently, I don't believe that is a problem with CFA members. I don't think it's a problem with many of the other commodity organizations. There have to be a clear line of communication. Those organizations have to do a good job of communicating to their farmer members what it is that they stand for, why are they there, and how do they fit their own agenda into the larger agenda together with other organizations and other commodities in Canada. And so if farmers are paying the bill, they need to make sure that that is happening.
Great. Andy, I'm going to go to you on the next question related to what Bob just said. Everybody has their own agenda, but when you're dealing with an umbrella organization, they have number one, they have number two, but issue number 15 may not make it in the meeting. And on occasion, issue number 15 does matter to a number of people within the sector as well. So do you get a sense on occasion that dealing with an umbrella organization, you may not get all the story, or you may there may be trade-offs on what is presented to you as a minister?
Well, let me build on what Bob said, because it depends sometimes. So if you're talking about a broad policy issue, then having an umbrella organization like the CFA present it makes a lot of sense, particularly if they've done work, which they do, to try to build a consensus and see what's there. But at the same time, there may be a commodity specific issue as a minister that you want to hear directly from a commodity organization. It could be more technical in nature. It could have to do with a particular funding program, and so you'd want to hear from folks as well. But I would say this, Serge, if somebody's going to go talk to a minister and they have 15 priorities, that in itself is probably not a real good idea. If I know it's difficult. And particularly, I would suspect in somebody that played the role that Bob did, to say to somebody, look, these are our three. These are the top three. I know what you want is important, but we'll have to find another way to do it. Because if you came into a minister and dumped 15 priorities on him or her, the challenge is if there are 15 priorities, then nothing's a priority. And that's a challenge. So yeah. Both organizations, both the umbrella organization, when you're dealing with broad policy issues, are important. If you have a commodity specific issue, as a minister, I wanted to hear that too, but that was a different form, a different way of doing it. And so, but my goodness, if you're in the business now of advocating, don't come with a list of 15 issues.
Absolutely.
May I add to that, Serge? Yeah. I certainly agree with that, and it is definitely the responsibility of the organizations that are meeting with the minister to prioritize. You can't walk in there with a want list of 10 issues and say, minister, deliver on all of these. You need to prioritize which is the most important for the industry at the time. The other thing that I think we need to always be sensitive of is that the minister isn't in government by him or herself. They also have another table that they have to go around. And I think of that especially when it comes to lobbying for money. And about 9 of the 10 years I was president of CFA, we had brutal net farm incomes. And of course, we were always lobbying for ad hoc funding. Well, we had to be sensitive to the fact that if it was Minister Mitchell that we were asking for money for, we had to recognize the fact that he had to go to a cabinet table where all the other ministers wanted money too, right? It wasn't just agriculture that wanted money. All the other jurisdictions wanted money as well. And so there needs to be sensitivity to that as well. And then on the issue of commodity specific or general issues, I mean, let's use the classic example, which is trade policy. CFA did a lot of work on trade policy. And in fact, we helped the government build its initial DOA negotiating position. And that's always, of course, a dichotomy between we need exports. We have a lot of export interests in agriculture, and we have to have an aggressive trade agenda because our agricultural industry is reliant on solid export markets and expanding export markets because we just don't have the market ourselves. Then, of course, we have supply management, which is more trade sensitive. And most of the people that I work with understood that very well. In fact, on my own farm at the time, I had a turkey operation and a hog operation. Well, they had 2 distinct trade policy interests. And so it was easy for me to understand that if I went to Andy in Bolivia or in Hong Kong at the WTO meeting and told them, listen, I don't care about supply management. I want you to negotiate on behalf of the hog industry. We want more markets. Well, I know for a fact that Andy, as the agricultural minister in Canada, was not going to go negotiate for just for one sector. He had to figure out how to negotiate in the best interest of the entire sector, including supply management, including the hog industry, so that both my turkey operation and my hog operation were better off for the trade agreement that we had, which is difficult at times, and they have to make certain decisions. But it's never failed to amaze me when commodities think that if they can meet with the minister alone and hammer him on what their specific commodity interests are, that the minister is now going to say, okay, yeah, no one else matters in Canada except for your commodity. That's just not the way things work. And so again, that points to the importance of collaboration, because we know that that's how the government is going to approach it.
Absolutely. And on the topic of the 15 priorities, my two former chairs, Leanne and Wilf, would remember that before any meetings with any government officials, we would strategize and make sure we would come up with 3 top things to ask for. So Andy, we listened to your message way before we've heard it today, and I think that's a key issue on that front. Bob, you've talked about the importance of collaboration, and indeed, this is where I think we're getting at in this discussion a little bit, the need to collaborate, whether or not by grouping, by the umbrella organizations, or by assembling efforts a little bit on that front. But is there a fear that when you collaborate, you are going to lose some of the subject matter expertise, or you're going to lose the individuality of the case that is being made? That's a concern that some express on occasion. And the follow-up question to Andy will be: collaboration is indeed great, but how do you see beyond the collaboration to ensure that all the voices, a little bit like what Bob mentioned in his example of turkeys and hogs, everything is well represented? So Bob, first, maybe on the collaboration and the fear of a loss of the individuality in those collaboration, and then Andy after. Bob?
Well, no, I don't think there has to be a fear of the loss of individuality. Remember, the way we used to approach it is that, look, and I would tell the hog, I would tell the Canadian Pork Council, I said, what is your commodity specific issue? Do you want us to weigh in on it with government or in public? And they would let us know what the messaging was on a commodity specific basis. If we had them around the table and we were collaborating on a larger, more general issue, we were comfortable with the fact that they were bringing expertise to the table. Other commodity organizations were doing the same thing. But then also remember, we had the benefit of having 10 general provincial farm organizations around the table who all in their own province had to do exactly the same thing that we were trying to achieve nationally. And so that brought more cachet to any eventual outcome we had from the discussion and the final recommendation that we would come out of there with.
Absolutely. Andy, would you like to weigh in on this?
Sure. And let me just tell you a little bit of a story. When I first got appointed to cabinet, I had the opportunity to be working with a long-serving minister, Herb Gray, who had been there long before I had been there, and he took me aside, as a youngster, as compared to Herb, and he said, Andy, when you go into the cabinet room, if you take the attitude that it has to be your way all of the time, and if everybody goes around that table with the view that it has to be their way all of the time, then none of you are going to get anything any of the time. And, Herb said it just almost exactly that way. And it really, it stuck with me. The importance of needing to build a consensus. And, if you can get 80% of what you need 80% of the time, then you've probably been successful. As a minister, you need to operate that way. And farm organizations, in a sense, have to have that conversation amongst themselves, and I'm sure Bob's had them. you can take the position that I have a particular perspective and my members want me to push that particular perspective, and that's what I will do. I will leave it to others to build a consensus, whether that be a national farm organization or whether that be the government. Or you can play in that field that says, I'm going to try to stitch together a consensus view that I will then promote. Different organizations take different approaches. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's as a minister, one of the things that you reflected upon was what you were hearing. Was it the product of a consensus building exercise, or was what you were hearing was a particular a group that had a very specific issue that it wanted you to know about and was going to really leave it to me or leave it to the government to figure out how to weave that in?
And if I may bring an anecdotal evidence on that, when AIC developed its agricultural research policy in 2015, we consulted with over 800 organizations, 400 of which provided a substantive statement on what we developed. And when we pushed it out in 2015, just before that election, it was seen as much more credible due to the effort that we had done. And this is why we were pleased to see some of the statements we had made and others had made, to be fair to other organizations, taken up by the government after its election. It's simply because when you do a good job at consulting and build a consensus, you come up with a common sense solution that people are much more likely to implement. Now, that brings me to the research and innovation agenda in Agri-Food. Is there, in your mind, any collaboration that should be existing between the various groups on this? Are there ways for better collaboration? Andy, when you were Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, was the research agenda at the top of the priorities when groups came to see you, and reflecting on that period, how could the research and innovation sector of the agri-food industry better collaborate to push on its agenda?
Well, from my perspective, and it's my own personal perspective, I'm not speaking for anybody, pushing a research agenda around broad pillars is probably more effective than a specific, very narrow commodity need. I'm not diminishing that as being important, but when you're dealing with the federal government, if you could be talking about pillars, and here I'm saying, like, how do you increasing yields, environmental protection, production processes, etc. Those broad themes, I think, is more effective. It's certainly something I think that is more easily actionable by the government. So that would be one point. I think one of the ways that government, and you see this in a number of areas now, can encourage a collaboration is if you're funding research, is to bonus that funding when you see collaboration taking place. So if you have 2 or 3 sectors coming together to willing to do research, that is a bonus points, for lack of a better way of saying it, in scoring and evaluating the application. So you're really creating an incentive for organizations to work together on the research. So I think that's a way to do it, because the reality is there's a finite number of dollars that are going to be put there by any government. That may move up or down depending on a particular year, but there are always a finite amount of dollars. And so the more collaboration that can be had, I think the more effective and the further that money is going to go.
Absolutely. Bob, would you like to comment on that issue, the research and innovation push for the sector?
I can't say very much about that, Serge, because that wasn't as big an issue. And I hate to tell you how long ago it was when I was president of the CFA, because that just tells you that I'm as old as the furniture. But the research wasn't that big back then, simply because we were fairly preoccupied, first of all, with developing the agricultural policy framework, which had a small research pillar, of course, but also in the face of, and then in the wake of, some brutal grains and oilseeds prices that created a devastating low net farm income. And so that really was our preoccupation. I do remember, though, that when the Liberal government came to power in, was it 93 or 94, Andy? I can't remember. 93. Of course, then after that, we moved into cost recovery, and we were concerned that too much money was taken out of research portfolios, and that far too much of it was becoming private research and proprietary research. And so we were concerned about what was going to happen to the farmers' interest in that regard. But other than that, I can't really make a comment.
I appreciate that. And Bob, furniture was well made in those years, so there's no issues there. And if you were lobbying Andy in the 1990s, I was around, so we'll just say it's just a couple of years ago.
Well, I think speaking about furniture, I think it was, wasn't it Senior Trudeau that said someone came up to him and complained about the cabinet that he had formed after the election, and Trudeau said to her, "I can only form a cabinet with the lumber that you supply me."
Yes, and I think Prime Minister Jean Chrétien said similar things in Alberta at one point, in a maybe a little bit rougher way. If you don't vote for me, I won't put you in. But anyway, we'll move on that before some friends start throwing virtual tomatoes at some of those comments. The minister's office deals with stakeholder relations, and in the agri-food sector, that's a lot of a very large number of organizations. Is there a sense a little bit that the multiplicity of opinions and the multiplicity of views represented enable the government to draft its own agenda without by being able to say, well, there is no consensus in the sector, so we just need to move ahead on that front? And the reason I'm asking that question is that's exactly what I heard from a senior bureaucrat at one point. So Andy, would you comment on this, that in some cases the large number of voices, the differences of opinion is actually making it easier for government officials to trudge ahead with their own agenda?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that's always a danger. So in the lack of any consensus, that a government would fill that void. Having said that, though, as a minister, and a good example of that, and Bob brought it up earlier, WTO negotiations. So something that I got to do that none of my fellow negotiators from any other country, at least not to the extent that we did, is every night you would go back to the hotel and meet with, and Bob was part of that, maybe 40, 43, 44 different organizations, none of whom, I shouldn't say none of whom, but all of whom had a somewhat different perspective, and some of them a diametrically opposed perspective. I took the attitude that I needed to listen to all of them and to say that all of those perspectives were important. It was a lot harder work, and it was time consuming, but it was necessary because that room represented the diversified type of industry that we had. You deal with some other countries and their industry was far less diversified. They could take particular positions. It was a lot easier for them. So you could take the attitude, okay, if none of you agree, I'll do it for you. I wouldn't think that's the best way to do it. You've got an obligation to weave those various threads into some sort of strong piece of rope. That's what you're trying to do. So yeah, there's a danger that the government just throws up its hands and says, well, if you can't agree, then I'll just decide for you. But I think what you really want to do is to work with that and try to bring it all together. And that's where the 80% rule comes in. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to do that, if you're going to build a consensus, then you can't get everything. And what you're trying to do is to get the key elements of what you need and be willing to do a bit of compromise. I know compromise is really not a big healthy word in politics these days in some cases, but it's an important ingredient because if you have different views, if you have a variety of views, if you're going to find common ground, then you're going to have to be willing to accept less than 100%.
And before I go to you, Bob, I'm going to remind the audience to put their questions for the Q&A buttons on this. You can type your question there. Bob, you know, I'm going to take the devil's advocate position on this. Did you ever feel at any point in time that sometimes some public servants or political staff or politicians were quite happy to see differences of opinions because it enabled them to move ahead in the way they wanted without having to follow one view or another?
Well, I can't comment on whether they were happy or not, but I can tell you that farm organizations didn't do and don't do themselves any favors if they can't collaborate, because it gives the opportunity to government and to the minister of making the decision that they want to make, right? I mean, all we have to do is put ourselves in the place of a minister, and if you've got 15 different viewpoints, there is no indication that there's going to be a compromise or a collaboration from the standpoint of the ag organizations. Then the minister has the freedom to actually make the decision that he or she thinks is best. And so it's really, I mean, I think that lands squarely in the laps of farm organizations. They need to recognize that the best approach is a collaborative one. And I just want to make a comment on what Andy said about compromise. He is absolutely right. And the example he said, what used when he mentioned what Herb Gray had told him. You know, we had one specific example. I think there was a $200 billion allocation of money coming. And if I remember correctly, it had to do with transitioning into the agricultural policy framework. That was back when Lyle Van Cleef was the minister. And he had to figure out how to allocate that money between provinces. And he sent an official to a CFA annual meeting. We had our Business Risk Management Committee meeting. And he put, I think that official put 4 or 5 different options in front of us and said, which one do you think the minister should use to allocate the money? And there was one option that actually allocated money disproportionately. And when I say disproportionately, I mean they weren't using the Fredericton formula, which I'm not going to go into explaining, but the allocation was disproportionate to what was precedented. So we actually had provincial organizations vote in favor of the formula to allocate ag hop money that gave provinces like Saskatchewan, Manitoba more money, because they recognized that the grains and oilseed sector was hurting the worst. And so you had a province like Quebec, UPA, Laurent Pellerin was president at the time. He voted in favor of giving more money to Saskatchewan. If he had voted for a different option, then Quebec would have gotten more money, but he recognized that the grains and oilseed sector was hurting very badly. And so that was compromise and that was collaboration. And the minister accepted the recommendation because he recognized there was 10 provincial organizations that were in favor of using that option.
Great. Appreciate that. We do have some questions coming in, and the first question is in terms of the national, having a national innovation strategy. The question comes from Dave Smarden from Bioenterprise, and the question is that unlike other countries such as France, Brazil, UK, Ireland, Chile, and others, we do not have an overarching national innovation strategy. Does this not put Canada at a disadvantage, as we tend to act as a dysfunctional group of regions with no common agenda? And for the record and the background, to be clear, AIC is advocating for the creation and the development of a national innovation strategy. We're not saying what should be in there. That should be the topic of conversations, consultations. We're just saying there needs to exist one, to have one. Andy and Bob, would you comment on that? Andy first.
Well, I'm not a practicing federal politician right now, or provincial for that matter. So my comments will be very general. So I think intuitively a national strategy makes some sense. There's some realities. We're a federation, right? We have 10 provinces, 3 territories, and a federal government, and you really do need to coordinate. Agriculture is a shared responsibility between the provinces and the federal government, and so you need to take that into account. That adds a lot of complexity to any kind of a national strategy. Having said that, I think it is important to try to move beyond those structural issues and to actually to have a national strategy. Look, our success at the end of the day, it depends on our ability to compete in the world, and that's very true of agriculture as well. And we need to be able to have a robust research agenda that equips our producers and our processors to be able to lead the world. We've done it in the past, and it served Canada well, and I think we need to do that going forward.
Great. Bob, can you comment on this? And I did take your initial note and statement. I am not here to represent the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, so I'll just say that we invited you, Bob, as Bob Friesen.
That's fine. No, and I would have to say that question is above my pay grade at the moment, and so it would be better referred to CFA. Okay,
very good. I know that there are two other questions that are a little bit beyond our topic on this, but there's a question from Dr. Leanne Dwyer. What are panelists' opinion on the effect of the current multiplicity of lobby groups effect on whether or not the ag sector has received the appropriate level of funding and recognition relative to the ag sector's role in the economy and society? Basically, is the fact that our voices are very diverse and potentially diluted being detrimental to versus sectors such as the oil and gas, who are very united, or the auto sector, who are very united in their presentation and therefore are more visible, potentially maybe more visible to politicians. Do you think that has an impact, Andy?
Well, I think it can have an impact, but there's ways to mitigate that. And comparing agriculture to the automotive industry or even to the oil and gas industry, look, agriculture is a very diversified, very diverse industry. There are literally hundreds of commodities. There is differences in the way we do things in different parts of the country and different climates. As Bob mentioned earlier, we have some of our production is earmarked for internal consumption, others for export. So it's complex. So it should not come as a surprise that we have a number of different organizations. But to go back to some of my opening comments, the key is not quantity, it's the quality of the representation. So it's incumbent upon those organizations to find some common ground, to use some of the what I call aggregators or umbrella organizations, particularly when it comes to policy, to make their case. And it's, look, as a minister, you're going to receive representation on very specific issues from specific commodity groups, and you want to facilitate that, because there are specific things you may want to deal with. But I think the question is more to the broader policy issues. And it's on those where you want to try to develop some sort of consensus within the industry and make that case in that way. So there, yeah, I think the industry is going to lend itself to lots of groups, but you need to be able to build the consensus when you're making the advocacy to the government.
Fair enough. Bob?
I would agree with Andy 100%. And just to add, look, let's be clear about one thing. When Andy was minister and farm leaders would come before him, he was well aware of which organizations had done their due diligence in collaboration and in compromising and reaching out to organizations to try to come up with one position. He was well aware of it. Ministers know this, and so they recognize which one of the farm leaders come to them with that behind them, or which farm leaders come to them simply with the attitude, it's all about us and don't bother about anybody else.
Fair enough. Thank you for that answer. One question, a little bit veering off from our topic, but I'll ask it anyway. Is it smart to lump farm policy, such as unofficial income floor support, with rural people policy and or food chain business policy? Bob?
You want to read that question again?
Absolutely. Is it smart to lump farm policy, such as income support programs, etc., with rural people policy, rural development policies, and or food chain business policies?
Well, you know, when I was president of the CFA, and I don't know that it's changed at all, farmers never wanted to be part of what was considered a social program. Yes, they wanted some business risk management programs, not to make them profitable. That's not what BRM programs are about, to make farmers profitable, but to provide either a bridge, if I may call it that, or a Band-Aid until the markets were profitable again. And so to talk about farm programs, BRM programs within the context of social programs, I don't think is appropriate. They are meant to be commercial oriented. They are meant not to make farmers profitable, not to take the place of good market decisions, not to take the place of due diligence on the farm, productivity, efficiency, etc. They are just simply there as a Band-Aid and not a long-term solution.
Thank you. Andy, would you want to comment on that as well?
I will. There are really two separate but related policies. So a rural policy is a place-based policy, and it's about taking actions that will allow rural communities to build wealth, to succeed, to have access to services in a similar manner as urban communities. That's a place-based policy. And before I was Minister of Agriculture, I was Minister of Rural Development, and that very much is a horizontal approach in government. So a government tends to be organized vertically, but rural policy is across departments. So you'd be dealing with health, you'd be dealing with transport, you'd be dealing with natural resources, and you'd be dealing with that because they're all players. An agricultural policy is a sectorial policy. It's about a particular industry that has particular needs, and so you pursue that. So it isn't an either or. A government, in my view, is effective when it's pursuing a place-based rural policy, and at the same time it has sectorial policies, and one in agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most important industries we have in this country. And we need to have governments that can respond to the needs of agriculture and to make sure that we continue to be successful both domestically and internationally.
I appreciate that. I'll go to a question from Mike McMorris. Canada and provinces, like many governments around the world, have withdrawn from what used to be called extension. Industry has filled the gaps in some cases, but certainly not all. This is a key step in innovation. how can we work together, industry, to do a better job of getting research into practice? And I would echo those comments. It is one of the key things I hear when we talk about climate change, adoption of new technologies, and the issue is, where is the extension programs to support that? So is there a case to be made that potentially for extension groups need to work better together? Andy, would you want to take this on?
Well, it's, I guess, a bit of a charged question. Obviously, your ability, extension programs historically have always been important. How you actually make things happen on the ground are critical. How you apply technology and research is critical. And so there's clearly a need for that. Governments have had to make fiscal decisions over the years. So if you're going to advocate, then it would be most effective if you not only tell the government what it is you want, but if you have some suggestions about how they can deliver on that. So if you present to a minister a program that's, and I'm pulling numbers out of the air here, so just they're theoretical, and say, okay, this is going to cost $400 million to do it, then some sort of commentary about how the minister should approach, as Bob said, his or her cabinet colleagues about how to fund that 400 million. Are you suggesting that we divert resources from one area and put them into this area? Are you suggesting this be a brand new spending? It's really important, and I'm talking from a minister's perspective, right? Because if somebody comes into you and says, this is a great idea, here's a price tag, and by the way, you figure it out. Well, that is the minister's responsibility, but if you're able to come up with some ideas that he or she can try to convince his or her cabinet colleagues on, that would be helpful.
Appreciate that. The solution doesn't need to be just an explanation of the problem. It has to be how to implement it in the overall strategy that the government is putting forward. Bob, any thoughts on this?
I'm going to pass on that one, but I do want to, now that Andy, and of course, because he was in rural development just before he became minister, he understood that question much better. It's actually very important. Rural development, in addition to agricultural specific policy, is very important. And I know that the Canadian Federation of Agriculture is working on that right now, and it includes, as Andy mentioned, transportation. It includes broadband access. It includes trade corridors, and it includes all of those rural infrastructure are very, very important and should be treated apart from the agricultural policy, which we typically consider to be business risk management, perhaps research, perhaps addressing climate change, etc.
And I'm going to go back to the collaborations part of this through a question from Pierre Patel from CropLife. Do you think that ministers and political staff look for veins of commonality among different associations' positions and priorities? How significant is it for Ag Association to seek those high-level commonalities before meeting with officials, even if their priorities don't necessarily align? Bob.
Yes, I would love to address that question, especially since it's coming from Pierre Patel, who I've worked with together for quite some time. You know something? I think it's really important that farm organizations don't feel threatened by having to work with what might be considered non-farm organizations. While CropLife is certainly an agricultural organization, it would not be considered your typical farm organization, but it's time that, you know something, and we did this when I was president. We realized that we needed to include other organizations in our outreach. Actually, a good example of that is when I was chair of the Canadian Turkey Marketing Agency, and we were at the at the cusp of, or there was pressure on the agency to accept non-producer, or should I say processing people on the agency board. And there were those that felt threatened by it, and others said, no, we have to include them. I mean, their industry success is contingent on some of the decisions that are made here, and they need to have input on that decision-making process because they're part of the broader industry. And I think we always need to think of that and consider that.
Appreciate that. Andy, do you want to take this question too?
I think Bob's comments are absolutely straight on. And let me just add one thing to it. If you're a minister and you're trying to pursue an initiative in cabinet, the broader that you can paint that initiative, the broader that you can show its impact, the more likely you're going to have for success. And I don't mean just at the political level. Like all of us, I'm assuming most of the people on the call are very familiar with the role of the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office. The broader that you can position what it is you're trying to do, both in terms of its application and its impact and its results, the more likely you are to be successful. So it's if you can do that, I think it's helpful to what it is you're trying to achieve.
Great. That's going to lead me a little bit to another question before I go back to the questions that have been asked by attendees. But you know, you've evoked the PCO. There's the PMO, which is not Paul Martin's office, but the Prime Minister's office. There are a number of organizations at the federal level that have some elements of relevance to the agri-food sector. And in the report from Dominic Barton on the future economy for Canada, there was a statement saying that there should be more collaboration at the federal level and more of coordination at the federal level. So my question is twofold. One, do you agree that, and I know that's a loaded question as well, but do you agree that more collaboration, more coordination at the federal level should exist? And at the same time, looking from the other side, if I were a public servant and I'd be told, well, you know, it's time for you to collaborate and coordinate your actions with other departments, I'd say, well, that would be great if they could do the same thing in the agri-food sector. Andy, I'm going to ask you to take that on first.
Well, the government, federal, and for that matter, I've done some work provincially. It's organized on a vertical basis, not a horizontal basis. That's the fundamental piece of the organization, right? So transport deals with transport, industry deals with industry, health deals with health. That's the nature of it. What it's supposed to work and hopefully does is that what we used to refer to as the central agencies provide that coordinating function. So when you're a cabinet minister and you bring forward a proposal, it goes through PCO, and PCO has an obligation to, trying to remember my vocabulary, an interministerial, or would bring together officials and political staff from the various departments together to have a discussion about your initiative. They were supposed to be doing a coordinating piece. Finance did a coordinating piece. As ministers, we used to joke that their coordinating job was to simply say no, but they did, you know, whatever you were proposing needed to be, can we accommodate it in the fiscal framework, or do we have to expand the fiscal framework? Treasury Board is a central agency. There are a set of government rules that apply right across the boards, no matter what you do. And if you're suggesting something, a programming, the terms and conditions of that programming have to meet the standard conditions of the federal government. And PMO on the political side is the coordinating body. So yeah, things are done are done vertically, but there are horizontal agencies that, if they're working effectively, will bring that coordination. And I'll just mention one other thing. The question also determines on what it is that you're doing. If it's policy writ large, that horizontal approach is critically important. But at the same time, there is what I would call the modalities of putting a policy in place, the nuts and bolts, the specific things. Well, that really is probably better handled by a vertical organization with agriculture dealing with how you implement a specific thing. So part of it depends on whether you're talking broad policy or whether you're talking the modalities of a specific policy.
And I will push a little bit. If you look at research and innovation in the agri-food sector, there are 14 departments and agencies that have a direct involvement on this, and that's where I think some of the questions we got from some people before the meeting were going, right? It's hard to know who does what and how it's done on that front. Bob, would you like to answer partially on this?
Yeah, sure. In fact, on the comment you just made, I was recently at a Canada-Mexico partnership meeting, and we were talking about pesticide regulation and registration. And in Mexico, I believe there's 4 different departments that have to sign off on the registration of a pesticide. And you can imagine what sort of impediments that puts up in being efficient and timely. When CFA supported the signing of the agricultural policy framework back in Whitehorse, I can't remember what year that was. That was when Sammy Watson was deputy. One of the things we had been told is that the agricultural policy framework would help to get rid of the silos that we currently had when it came to the different policies that impacted on agriculture. And we were all in favor of, at a certain level, ministers and departments getting together and collaborating at their level when it came to certain policies. Say, for example, pesticide regulation. You've got the agricultural minister, then you have the health minister, under which pesticide regulation is located. And so it behooves those 2 ministers or those 2 departments to collaborate when it comes to pesticide regulation, because clearly the agricultural jurisdiction would understand some of the nuances better than the health department would. And perhaps the health minister really doesn't have the mind space to deal with some of those issues. And so we thought it was important to remove some of those silos. So you've got several departments. You've got environment, you've got transportation, you've got trade, you've got agriculture. And all of those departments impact on agriculture at some time or another. And where they overlap, we believe is where there should be collaboration between ministers and departments to make sure that they understand, one hand understands what the other is doing.
And I put myself on mute, which was probably very much liked by a lot of people. Leanne Dwyer had another question. Has the multiplicity of ag groups been a detriment to support of innovation, whether new commodities, processes, practices, or societal opportunities? Quick answer from either one of you. Andy?
Well, it's possible that they could, but there are ways to mitigate against that, to not allow that to happen.
Agreed. Bob?
No, that's good.
Great.
I agree.
Next question is from Dr. Deborah Buzzard. Many thanks to Andy and Bob for a great session today. My question to them both is, if they were in their previous roles, that's a question that is always difficult on that, especially if you want to be able to chat with the person who's in that role right now. If you were in your previous role today, what would they be thinking of as priorities for this new government? And maybe as a follow-up, where should the government be investing to enable future successes for the agri-food sector? So if you had if you were able to have the pen on where we were going in the future, where would it be going? Where would be your top priorities right now? And I think that's maybe the best way to phrase it. What would be your top priorities? Andy?
Well, that's a tough question, being out of the loop. But let me just take a very general stab at this. We tend to have in this country urban-based governments, and I think we do again. And that's not strictly to the current party that's in power, but when the Conservatives are in power, the nature of that party changes a little bit because it's been successful because it's elected urban members. And it's really important that the case is made that the success of agriculture goes way beyond simply agriculture. The success of agriculture is the success of Canada. It's been thus for generations, and it's going to continue to be. Agriculture is a highly innovative. It's utilization of state-of-the-art technology. People sometimes have an antiquated view of what agriculture does and the way that it does it. And so we need to make sure that all Canadians, whether you live on Bay Street in Toronto or whether you live on Main Street in where I am right now in Lakefield, Ontario, and in the Selwyn Township, that it's critical for the success of everybody, and that we don't allow ourselves to be siloed. And so that's a very broad answer to that question, because I don't have the briefs on the various items that are taking place, but I think that's important. Agriculture accounts for a significant part of our GDP. It accounts for a significant amount of our employment. It accounts for a significant amount of our international trade. And I think sometimes, and I've not been at the federal level for some time, but I think sometimes Canadians aren't as well aware of that as they possibly could.
It's a fantastic answer, Andy. And before Bob answers as well, I remember being in the Finance Committee meeting, making a presentation on behalf of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, talking about the importance of agri-food research, making a couple of recommendations, and looking at a member of Parliament that I've known for years, checking his Facebook account. So after the meeting, I went to him and I said, well, visibly you were very interested. And his reply was, well, this is agriculture. I don't have a huge amount of agricultural folks in my writing. And he was definitely in the urban zone. And I replied to him, but you have about 40 to 42% of your workforce that works in the agri-food sector. And that was an eye-opener. To his credit, he became a little bit more engaged in future discussion. Bob, would you like to take a stab at that, please?
Sure. As far as the priorities in agriculture in general, they are exactly what current President Mary Robinson would tell you they are if you asked her that question. When it comes to the three files that I have at CFA, transportation, trade, and Hay West, in transportation, of course, it's road infrastructure, it's harmonizing trucking regulations between provinces to make sure there are no interprovincial impediments, and making sure we have the ability and the capacity to continue to address our international markets, and to be able to, in the future, address international markets that will have to continue to grow and expand. On trade, an aggressive trade agenda, negotiating more and more profitable market access in other countries, while at the same time maintaining Canada's ability to keep supply management. That one shouldn't be nearly as tough as some people make it out to be. Look, supply management in Canada already is more import transparent and allows more imports than many other commodities in other countries. And so instead of apologizing for supply management, we should actually be bragging about supply management, how transparent they are on imports and on allowing market access with what they already are doing in comparison to what other countries are doing with commodities. And on Hay West, We've got 60,000 round and square bales waiting in Ontario, Atlantic Canada, and Quebec to be moved, and we'd like to move them as quickly as we could to Western Canada, to those people that so desperately need it.
Absolutely, and thank you, Bob, for that. If I may add, one of the key priorities, especially for the Agri-Food Innovation Council, is research and innovation. Keep it at the top of the agenda and ensure that it is clearly understood by all that our sector is going to continue to thrive if we continue to invest in research and innovation for the agri-food sector. On this, I want to thank both of you very much for participating in this panel discussion. Bob, you've been fantastically politically correct on ensuring the CFA position was right at the top of the agenda. Thank you so much, Bob, for participating. And Andy, it was great to see you. You have absolutely, and you would have known, I was a kid when you were a minister, but I do remember you, and the people had a huge amount of respect for you when you were a minister there. So thank you so much, both of you, for participating. I'm going to draw this to a close. We will have another webinar in about a month and a half. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for your questions. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Andy.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.